The hope that I have is in the human exchanges where decency and intelligence inform the dialogue.
Better public decision making by breaking bread together. And as odd as it may seem, television can help. We're putting the future of American civics in context.
TFIC takes you deeper into the stories that are shaping the future of state and local government.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart, I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From governing and government technology, this is The Future in Context. With Paul Taylor, I'm Ashley Silver. It may not be the first thing that comes to mind when West Coasters drive by a 76 gas station, but their namesake year, 1776, was 248 years ago. Simple math suggests that the country's 250th birthday comes on July 4th, 2026. Technically, it is called the quarter millennium or semi-quin-centennial. It's hard to say, but does provide a reminder that it is not too early to take stock of how the Republic is doing and what its prospects look like. Alexander Heffner is a journalist, civic educator, and historian who has been thinking about the American experience for a long time. He is the host of The Open Mind on PBS, a role he has held since 2014. He also created Breaking Bread with Alexander on Bloomberg TV, where he engages in conversations with political figures over shared meals. Heffner is known for his in-depth discussions on democracy, media, technology, and ethics. One of those discussions was the one he had with Paul.
Alexander Heffner, welcome to The Future in Context.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
So let's begin with some background and biography. In many respects, you are in the family business. How does someone become Alexander Heffner?
Well, I had the good fortune of being grandfathered into a tradition on television that is the longest running series in the history of public media. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page of the longest running programs, TV shows in the history of the medium, you'll find The Open Mind, the program that I've hosted for the past 10 plus years, a program on which I succeeded the founder, my grandfather, Richard D. Heffner. It's interesting to be hosting a program that in 1956 was state of the art and still is state of the art, but it's on an antiquated medium. And I think it's state of the art because what we endeavor to do on The Open Mind is different than what is done on the vast majority of media platforms, whether they're social media or traditional mainstream media. And that is what my grandfather envisioned as a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. And it's more and more challenging in a divisive, dysfunctional media and political environment to strive for media that's going to help elicit sound public policy. But that's really a lot of my personal aspiration as a journalist is to help precipitate, generate, facilitate discussions that are going to make more efficacious policy decisions.
Now, in your decade or so of doing it, how is your theory working out?
The theory is working insofar as there are dedicated public servants and policy practitioners who still are idealistic, who still do studies and experiment with novel policymaking, first in maybe one community or state, and then want to expand the laboratory of democracy to national or federal jurisdictions. It works for me because for 10 years, I sit across from people either on Zoom or in in-person gatherings and feel like they are listening to the questions and that there is a genuine back and forth. And that is the aspect of deliberation that you at governing know exists at the municipal and state level to a degree that we feel it's disappearing or all but finished at the congressional level or the national political discourse, being insipid, being problematic, and reduced to talking points and punching bags. And that's why I created a special series of The Open Mind called Breaking Bread with me, Alexander. And it's premiered on Bloomberg TV last summer of 2023. And the second season is available now both on my PBS series and on Bloomberg. And the idea was to, in effect, take the operating software of our culture, which is the reality TV program, and something that unites Republicans, Democrats, and independents, conservatives, liberals, libertarians, even anarchists, and that is food, the universal language of nourishment. And to take that as the starting point of having a meal with our high-profile governors and senators from across the country and attempting to open up conversation about policy, politics, family in a way that is non-adversarial but is also substantive, and that will engage the participants in wanting to not be paralyzed in the public sphere, but team up with fellow politicians, whether that's at the state level or the national level, to make change happen. And so this program, Breaking Bread, which is comedians in cars getting coffee merged with Face the Nation, is an honest attempt to do what is not done in the vast preponderance of media, which is incentivize a culture of peace building, healing, and deliberation. And that's what this is about. So it is working from that perspective on a small scale, that I am establishing a different set of incentives than cable news or even the Washington Post or New York Times. When you've watched their convention coverage, it is also stenography. It's telegraphing exactly what these candidates want to project, but it's not exchanges of deliberation, and it's not focused coverage of how policy can become sounder or more effective. And so from that perspective, it's working for me.
As you've been breaking bread, who has given you hope and why?
The hope that I have is in the human exchanges, where I think decency and intelligence inform the dialogue. And I come away from a dialogue, whether it's season 1 with Senator Booker in Newark, or Governor Cox in Salt Lake City, or season 2 with Governor Gordon in Wyoming, or Senator Kelly in Arizona, where I come away feeling that these are elected officials who are representing the diverse populations in their constituencies, but also have a desire to enact more effective policymaking. And to answer your question more specifically, I think that there is the macro overview, and that is that people who've participated in my series understand that we need to learn from each other, and that requires empathy and listening and compromise. And that politics is a politics that once existed in a two-party system. So people blame a duopoly, blame the divisiveness that's animating the duopoly, but we've had a Democratic and Republican Party as our primary two political parties, and more genuine exchange of ideas and compromise legislation and consensus building. I mean, that did happen, and there are a multitude of examples historically of that. You can go to Ira Shapiro's Last Great Senate and find when leaders, the Sam Nunns and Dick Lugers, the Orrin Hatches and Ted Kennedys, did find common ground. So that existed in America, and it doesn't now. So that's the macro lens that is inspiring when there's a back and forth that illuminates this idea that when it comes to the economy or healthcare, there's a shared pursuit of a end goal: affordable quality housing, affordable quality medical treatment, healthcare, affordable quality education. So in any of those moments, I feel inspired that we're doing meaningful work. When it comes to the micro, the specific instances of policy or reform, I think it depends on whether I'm interviewing a governor or a senator. Certainly, Governor Cooper in North Carolina touted his state as one that has governed in a way that is friendly for the economy, but also friendly for environmental sustainability. And every survey of best business practices in the last 5 years has ranked North Carolina consistently on the top of that list of economic productivity and climate resilience. So I see ingenuity in merging these ideas that are viewed as opposites. And anytime one of these governors or senators recognizes that these are not opposing ideas, but policy that can be stewarded in harmony, that also gives me confidence that there is a constructive public service vision. And these are very challenging times when we think of governing the landscape of federalism and respecting state and national boundaries. There's no doubt that separate and apart from the pandemic and its lasting effect on the American economy and the resurgence of an inflationary climate, that there have been troubled waters since the Great Recession. And that's something that I emphasize in asking my guests, governors and senators, about the nature of economic disequilibrium. I don't know that people who represent the country, and I don't know that even the voters fully grasp how imbalanced our economic footprint is today versus 50 years ago. And I asked my guests about the culture, not just a status quo of a housing crisis, for example, and exploding inflation in the real estate industry, but this idea that there is not an equilibrium in the American economy. And whether you want to think of that in terms of equity or fairness, we can each use the word that we're more comfortable with. But as a result of trust building as opposed to trust busting, as a result of the tax code not being in sync with the billionaire class of this country, I truly feel that President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, President Dwight David Eisenhower, both Republicans, would not recognize what it means to govern in this country. There is this mythology of carry a big stick, libertarianism, manifest destiny, that we are in control, but there are many corporate overlords who govern practically everything we do in this country. And I just don't think that America would be a recognizable place. You may have had Rockefellers and Carnegies, but they didn't control multiple industries at the level that they do now. And so governing seems to me to be viewed as less idealistically and more realistically in a climate where there isn't really much to salvage, and you're working within a system of plutocracy and what one author called in his book cannibal capitalism. And it's hard to govern in a culture where there is a monopolistic capitalistic reality that if you want to build a shelter because there are a lot of unhoused people in your state or your city, you're more likely to succeed with support from the private sector in putting up that affordable housing or that rehabilitative transitional housing, then you are getting government to put up a facility, and that is a culture we live in, that I ask these electeds about. What does it mean to govern in America today?
And what is our way forward? What have you learned about that?
The answer to your question is accountability, not just for expenditures of government, but how they are connected to a bottom line for all constituents. And that's the thing about the federalist system. It's it's a brilliant system that I think has been our magic bullet in a lot of respects in staying alive and having robust disagreements, but preserving the union over these hundreds of years now. But we shouldn't allow ourselves to get lost in policy in the way we do and not see the connecting tissue that is necessary for a $1 trillion program or a multi-billion dollar program. That needs to have discernible and understandable concrete improvement in other areas of public life in order to work. And, it's not even enough to advertise, as President Obama did with the Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And now you see on the roads of America, the Biden Infrastructure Act touted. But how is that going to connect with housing unaffordability? And I haven't seen the policy illuminated in that way. But that is the path. I think understanding the connective tissue of policymaking, and not getting lost in minutia, or just some 1,000-page piece of legislation. It's okay if something is 1,000 pages of pieces of legislation, but it needs to connect to every realm of society in order to make a difference.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I want to change gears just a little bit and focus on a couple of personalities, one of whom you've interviewed and the other one you've had at least a brush with. And they are two neighboring Midwest governors. And in some ways, they couldn't be more different parties, but both were contenders in their respective parties' Veep stakes. And I'd just like you to, tease out what makes them the same. Maybe it's a Midwestern thing, and where you would differentiate between the two of them. Person A guy that you put on a special hat for, that would be North Dakota's Doug Burgum. And reportedly, America's wealthiest governor, $1.1 billion net worth, former software entrepreneur, and yet a deep love for the Dakota territories, to use old Roosevelt language. And then his neighbor, Tim Walz in Minnesota, reportedly the least wealthy governor in the country, reporting a net worth of zero. Talk to me about both those guys and whether there's some Midwest magic there that ties them together, or whether they operate in different worlds.
Great question. So I've had the good fortune of spending time with both, and interviewing both. Governor Burgum warms up over the course of a conversation. I would not call him easygoing in the way that Governor Walz is and was. I interviewed him when he was an unknown congressional candidate calling into a radio show I was hosting. He was outside. I'll never forget. He was outside of an Arby's, like in an Arby's parking lot, calling in. And I mean, he was the same jovial, free spirit. At that time, really concerned that people that he served with were not getting adequate armor and weapons in these brave new wars, brave new world wars that we hadn't really experienced since Vietnam, the kind of guerrilla style wars where an IED might go off at any moment. And he was getting correspondence from from friends and colleagues in the military that they don't have armor, so much that military men and women were buying armor and weapons on eBay online because they weren't getting adequate protection from an administration that was singing patriotism, George W. Bush, President Bush, but in reality, utterly, woefully ill prepared for the realities of the insurgency and combat in Iraq. Likability, at the end of my time with Burgum, I could see him as someone I'd grab a beer with, but it only takes a few minutes with Governor Walz to know you'd like to grab a few beers with him. You know, there is something about them both that's intellectually honest. I found in the course of the interviews that we did, and recall that I interviewed and profiled Governor Burgum prior to the 2024 presidential campaign, prior to his campaign, prior to being a contender for Veep. And he was singing a different tune about practical governing and wanting to put North Dakota on the radar as a leader in education. He was passionate about the work being done at the University of North Dakota, and I'm sure he still is, about being able to use drones to sense conditions on the ground, whether that's conditions of highways or monitoring for environmental disasters, and seeing how the preservation of natural gas or other commodities is faring. And then, I'll just never forget going to the lodge and interviewing him, home of his old college roommate, hearing from the family that owns the lodge about how it was just a really miserable end of the winter. There are snowstorms up and through May in the Dakotas, and hearing about the young calves that didn't make it in the frozen tundra of North Dakota, and there is a recognition of being kind-hearted and connected to the land and having a love of the Dakotas you reference. And I think that's something that Governor Walz conveys in his relationship with young people in this country as a coach and social studies, U.S. history teacher. So, at the end of the day, there really is, in my view, more that brings these people together when they are not being exploited by the extremes of their political party, or they're not exploiting the extremes of toxic polarization in the body politic. It goes both ways. I think too often the political bosses, the cults of personality and the partisan media complex that we live with are the primary vehicles of that exploitation, as opposed to people like Burgum and Walz. There's one other Midwest governor I'd mention, and that's Governor Pillen, who ideologically is more associated with Governor Burgum, and he might even profess to be our most conservative ideologically governor. Governor Stitt of Oklahoma. So, we had Governor Stitt in season one, Governor Pillen, Stitt of Oklahoma, Pillen of Nebraska. They probably would claim to be the most conservative governors in the country. And Pillen is, at first blush, more like Walz in just the spirit of his humanity. Pillen played football rather famously for the Cornhuskers in one of the most famous Rose Bowl outings in history. He's a people person, and he's working on a major overhaul of taxation in Nebraska right now. That's been his primary initiative. There's a special session. That was the way he was bringing policy to that folksiness, and the humanity that he conveyed in our interview was a real focus on in his mind, the unfairness of housing, real estate taxes in Nebraska. I just mentioned one other thing because you alluded to Walz and his lack of investment in the stock market. I think that there is something quite charming and quite positive about Walz's background, especially compared to Speaker Pelosi. Bless her heart, she's someone who's tracked on Twitter not for her policy anymore, but her trades. I think that the fact that government officials, for now decades, the government officials at the highest levels are allowed to trade stocks willy-nilly, being on the inside of committee hearings and knowing the infrastructure of government dealings with corporations, this is inexcusable. And pretty confident that Governor Walz supports the legislative efforts to ban that, to ban trading by members of the House and all, maybe all federal elected offices. I would apply that to judgeships. Hell, there are probably municipal and state laws that restrict assembly people or district judges from trading stocks or even owning stocks in some instances, conflicts of interest with companies. And there is something so refreshing about Governor Walz having no portfolio of stocks and understanding that any decisions that he would be making as part of the executive branch would be motivated by the country and not by anything related to his personal holdings. And it brings to mind not just Speaker Pelosi, but former President Trump, and the fact that the Supreme Court basically said there's no problem governing potentially according to the interests of your business. I was surprised, even with a lopsided Supreme Court that favors the Republican Party and conservatives now, I was surprised that Justice Roberts completely ignored the emoluments clause. The emoluments clause is very clear that Donald Trump, if he is going to hold interest in a business, that we need to understand that business is only having domestic dealings so long as he is a part of that business. And we know that his company was making deals with foreign entities, Saudi Arabia, other countries, over a period of time. But Speaker Pelosi and former President Trump are two peas in a pod in this respect. There was no reason to believe, if you're an American citizen, a concerned citizen, that either one of them could separate their financial interests from their governing responsibilities. And that is a really important point. And I don't know what Vice President Harris's holdings are, but it's worth exploring that question if she'll be as consistent as Walz is on this question of not letting the appearance of impropriety or impropriety itself ensnare the Oval Office.
I want to acknowledge what you said earlier about the concerns that you have about the effects of late-stage capitalism on democratic institutions, and appreciate that you're not a historian. But let's talk just briefly about the next couple of years when the country turns 250 years old. How much hope do you have for a country that has had a long road since 1776? And is 250 years a reckoning or a party?
The idea of achieving life, liberty, and happiness, and America being a land where there is the capacity for that. And I think this is where it's important to understand what we've achieved, a beacon of liberty, and and many rags to riches stories of prosperity, but in many ways that's been too individualized. In many ways, the rags are still the reality, the challenge of governing in a way that there is going to be social stratification, but there is also going to be a bottom out, if you want to call it a safety net, and that's where we're struggling. I mean, in 2016, then candidate Trump and Senator Sanders tapped into something that I think is something that is as every bit relevant today, and that is the decaying economic picture for the average American, but also the cold shoulder that we turn at poverty and insecurity in some of our cities. And that's not only an urban problem. There is a similar phenomenon in rural America. And I think that through the process of doing Breaking Bread, I've listened and traveled around the country and seen the despondency, the despair does exist, and it exists on a scale that's not acceptable with all the innovation that we cite today as the American renewal. While we have the resilience of federalism and being able to share powers, I don't think that we have developed a resilient economy and one that understands, or let me put it this way, that achieves a baseline of happiness in the lives of Americans. I think there are too many extremes. And if we are going to learn anything about the next decade into our 260th year, I think it's going to be that. It's going to be establishing a baseline of happiness for the American people. We haven't done that. We haven't done that with a living wage. We haven't done that with affordable care. We haven't done that with housing. We've made some inroads in making available resources, for example, the Affordable Care Act. But I don't think we have a baseline of happiness in America. And that's what we ought to endeavor to do over the next decade. The new president, I think it's achievable, but it takes real commitment. And it also takes getting away from the squabbles about, is this overregulation or deregulation? Is this a conservative policy or a liberal policy? Let's go back to the Declaration. Can we achieve for our fellow person, a fellow American, our fellow man, woman, child, a baseline of happiness? That would be my question to launch into this next 250 years.
Against that background, I'd like to read an old quote from a guy who was actually an architect of an earlier era, Chicago's Daniel Burnham. And he wrote, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Is there some relevance there?
I think that's exactly what I'm trying to articulate. If he, I'm assuming he's not being facetious, and he really wants us to dream in the most limitless, imaginative way. Americans, I feel like, increasingly in our political environment, they're defensive. They are victims, or playing a kind of victim card in how they see themselves vis-a-vis politics. It's about scoring points on social media and there's always an element of victory in the political order. But now it's really a zero sum, all or nothing game that media play. It's really revolting that that there is the tendency on social media especially to be singularly right in your purity on an issue. So yeah, I mean, there is something to the quote. I just fear that the people who are thinking no small things, at every moment they're doing a purity test and shaming the other, and there are far too many organizations that exist, I think, and people who exist in the American political scene who are, by design, they are being lifted up to tear people down. We have to dream big, and at the same time, we have to recognize when other people are programmed to, their dreams are to tear people apart or subjugate other people because they don't think the way that they do about President Biden or Vice President Harris or President Trump or Senator Vance, right? And that is really the core of the hyperpartisanship and divisiveness in the culture, which is not only a political phenomenon, it's a social and cultural phenomenon too. The author of that quote had not envisioned in America where there were a majority of people who were winning awards on the basis of tearing people down. And that isn't the way to realize domestic tranquility or any of the other goals of our Constitution.
On that last point, tell me about your work moving forward. Who will you be breaking bread with, and what does the next year or so look like for you?
What I hope is that the social and political capital that we have sought to cultivate here can be tapped into as a new president transitions into the White House, the 47th president, whether that's President Trump or President Harris. I think that whoever is elected, the 47th president of the United States, and whatever Congress convenes next, that there is always an opportunity for a reset button. So my work, I hope very much, will intersect with the commencement of a new dawn, a new season of our political life. Let me just emphasize this for your listeners and readers. I care about this so much as a native New Yorker who saw 9/11 happen, as a native New Yorker, and whose consciousness about issues, both domestic and foreign, became so attuned to wanting to protect my fellow Americans after that horror and tragedy of 9/11. I don't know if you relate to this, Paul, but it's almost unstoppable that at least we would continue to do the work that we're doing, even if it's breaking bread with 10 more governors and senators in 10 new states. If that's the modest contribution we're going to be making, improving dialogue and understanding, then I'm all for it. But this is because it feels as though the American system has not been adequate. We didn't prevent the Great Recession. We didn't hold up well against the pandemic. Most countries didn't, but we were also responsible for creating conditions that made the housing meltdown and the unstopped spread of COVID possible. Those were policies that were deployed or absent that make or break the country. So in other words, I don't see governing or politics as the art of the possible. And I know, the Cuomos have been focused on the lines over the years. You campaign in poetry and you're governed in prose, but politics is not an esoteric art. It is the survival of our people and the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. The ongoing pursuit of those things, successful or unsuccessful. I think that you should be highly motivated to be improving the condition of our civic life in our country. We need to make a more perfect union, and that requires continued dialogue, deliberation, and the hope that some of the participants of Breaking Bread are going to say enough is enough, and we're not going to wait for the next 9/11 or pandemic. We're going to stop the malevolent forces around us, and we're going to uplift the positive policies that are going to improve people's lives and enshrine them in our fiber as a country.
Alexander, you have been gracious with both your time and your perspective. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Paul.
Alexander Heffner, author, historian, civic educator, and host of The Open Mind on PBS and Breaking Bread with Alexander on Bloomberg TV. We've got links to both of his shows in the show notes. Our editorial and production team includes Theo Douglas, Zoe Manzanetti, and Kaylee Tedrow. Our executive editor is Noel Now.
We're excited for a month-long series of episodes in October with Governing's Public Officials of the Year. It marks the return of the annual recognition for people who make government work that dates back 30 years. You can read about them in the fall issue of Governing or hear from them in depth as we talk with them and the writers who interviewed them. That all begins next week.
That's next time. And that will do it for this time out. For Ashley Silver, I'm Paul Taylor. Thanks for listening. Always forward.